Okay, so the book's going to be launched by Professor Sean Connolly, very well known to many people in this room, member of the Royal Irish Academy, fellow of the British Academy, Professor Emeritus of Irish History here at Queen's, author of numerous publications on many aspects of Irish history, including major survey works such as Contested Ireland, Ireland 1460 to 1630. Which came out in 2007, and Divided Kingdom, Ireland 1630 to 1800, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2008, and more recently the editor of Belfast 400, People, Place and History, which was published by Liverpool University Press in 2012. So I think no one better in terms of range of expertise in Irish history, certainly from the early modern period through to the very recent past, to launch this very prestigious collection from Cambridge. So I'll pass over to Sean, who will address us.
Thank you, Peter. So I look at you all across the no man's land, the front of the Great Hall. It's always puzzled me. We spend half our life as academics telling our students not to sit at the back, but come forward where I can see you. And we spend the other half as academics sitting at the back of the hall ourselves. It's one of those things. Book launches can become a fairly routine event where somebody arbitrarily chosen is pushed forward to say a few brief, appropriate words before everybody gets back to drink and the gossip. In this case, however, we are, I think, dealing with a real event in terms of Irish history publishing. I mean, there have been other high-profile historical publications in recent years. We've had an Oxford Handbook of Irish History. We've had a Cambridge Companion to Irish Social History. We've had 2 volumes from Princeton. Going further back, we've had an Oxford Companion to Irish History, and of course the invaluable multi-volume Dictionary of Irish Biography. But it does seem to me that to find something comparable in scale and conception to the 4 volumes we're celebrating this evening, you really have to go back a full half century to the New History of Ireland, the brainchild of Professor T.W. Moody, launched in 1969. Now, I mention the New History partly because it is obviously relevant, also because it was clearly very much in the minds of the editors of these volumes and of many of the contributors. In fact, I could almost say that reading through the 4 volumes, I sometimes got a whiff of something almost Oedipal, a sort of recognition of the importance of these predecessors and an urgent desire to move on from them as quickly as possible. But for the most part, what people say about the new history is favourable and is positive. And that is only fitting because the New History of Ireland was, for its time, a major achievement, summarising the results of the massive amount of new historical work that had been done between the 1930s and the 1970s. The 4 volumes are still an essential reference point. There was, however, a drawback. It was one of time. The New History of Ireland was announced in 1969. The writing was to be completed in clearly defined stages over the next 5 years, with everything finished by 1973 and published as soon as possible afterwards. In fact, the first volume came out in 1976. The last volume came out in 2005. By way of contrast, as far as I can see, discussion of this Cambridge history began somewhere around 2011 or 2012. And a mere 6 or 7 years later, here we have all 4 volumes. So are we looking at evidence of a major transformation of the culture of Irish academia? Or do we want to speculate about the behind-the-scenes activities involving warnings about career suicide and dire threats to the future well-being of small children and much-loved domestic animals that might have brought about this happy result? But either way, the authors, or the editors, are really to be congratulated on steering such a complex project with so many interlocking parts to completion against such a tight schedule. It is really a major achievement. Okay, apart from punctuality, which is, after all, the politeness of princes, what else and what other ways do these volumes break new ground? Well, first of all, there is the balance between political history and other themes. Very wisely, the editors haven't tried to duplicate the detailed event-by-event narrative of the new history of Ireland. So somebody who wants yet another discussion of the rights and wrongs of Cromwell's capture of Drogheda in 1649, or the tit-for-tat sectarian massacres in Wexford in 1798, or the shooting of 13 auxiliaries at Kilmichael in November 1920, really needs to look somewhere else. Instead, what you get is a series of elegant thematic essays on the politics of the period, focusing on long-term developments and on patterns of change. And that leaves room for a whole coverage of a whole range of other issues. Economic history is there, of course, and so are other familiar areas such as religion, art, and architecture. And then there are also newer, but by now fairly familiar, areas such as family and gender. But there are also chapters in here which are genuinely innovative. For example, we get chapters on political ideas, not just on the early modern period, on the age of Patrick Darcy and Molyneux, but also, totally unexpectedly and very revealingly, on political thought in medieval Ireland. For the 19th century, we get another equally unexpected and equally revelatory chapter on the bourgeoisie and the notion of the bourgeoisie in 19th century Ireland. Guy Biner gives the whole enterprise a reflexive turn with a chapter on historical memory. Another topic is material culture, which by now is pretty well established, but Susan Flavin, in her chapter, gives material culture a new twist by moving the discussion on, not just from counting on enumerating objects, but to trying to focus on the meanings that people attached to those objects. She also, incidentally, includes from the 17th century recipe book an account of a cure for convulsions involving one or more recently plucked pigeons that would give Rabelais' geese more than a run for their money. I'll leave you to find that for yourselves. Second striking characteristic of the two volumes, I think, is the strong interdisciplinary character of much of the work, the willingness to engage with work in other related disciplines. For me, at least, particularly striking here was the close cooperation between historians and archaeologists, reflecting, I think, major broadening of horizons on both sides. Jane Olmar, for example, begins her introduction to the early modern volume with a detailed account of the contents of the wash pit at Rathfarnham Castle outside Dublin, with everything it reveals about material consumption and about Ireland's international trading links. In the medieval volume, Maura Ní Bhuinig writes about a new type of scholarship with landscape and literature on the same page, which sums it up very nicely. And I thought that worked particularly well for the chapters on early Ireland. Some of you may have come across Voltaire's challenge to historians in the Philosophical Dictionary in 1764. If you've nothing to tell us but that one barbarian succeeded another on the banks of the Oxus, then what use are you to society? And of course, you could ask the same question about who succeeded whom, or what barbarian succeeded whom on the banks of the Shannon or the Lee, or if you want to think about recent events, on the banks of those parts of the Foyle and the Blackwater that poured through West Tyrone. But thanks to the marriage of history and archaeology, we move well beyond the banks, who succeeded whom in the banks of any river, to a sense of engaging with a real society and understanding something about how it functions. Third feature, I think, is the willingness to look beyond Ireland for comparisons and for comparative frameworks. Now, in his concluding overview in the early modern volume, Nicholas Canny yet again draws his sword against one of his favourite dragons, the new, or today the not-so-new, British history. But in fact, when you read the chapters, you see that the authors of these chapters have moved well beyond any of these such programmatic, pre-designed comparative frameworks. In the same way, you won't find very much in here about colonial and post-colonial perspectives. But you will find lots of comparisons where they make sense with colonial societies elsewhere. What we're getting instead is an eclectic, open-minded search, well-informed search for comparisons that actually help us to make sense of what we're finding in the case of Ireland. To give you just one example, Tiger Handercoin draws on his own work and that of others on Central Europe to cast light on the question of why is it that uniquely in Ireland an early modern state failed to impose its religion on the majority of the population. He also makes the interesting point that if you're looking at Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, the elaborate ceremonies and rituals of Baroque Catholicism, however much they're out of tune with our sensibilities today, did actually do a very good job in winning the hearts and minds of men and women across Catholic Europe. And this in turn means that the unfortunate Cardinal Rinuccini, so often criticised for his attempt to introduce this same Baroque culture into Ireland in the 1640s, might in fact have been on the right track after all. The final distinctive feature of this volume, which is something that's very often overlooked, but happens to be something dear to my heart, is the issue of periodization. How do you define the periods within which you study history? I first became aware of this when I asked a group of second-year students, all of whom were doing a course with me on early modern Britain and Ireland, what they actually understood by the term early modern. And only two of them could give me even a halfway decent answer. I realised there was a problem here. Even for those of us who think we understand the term, there are all sorts of issues. When does medieval become modern, for example? When does early modern become properly modern? Historians have been playing games along these lines for a long time with the boundaries of centuries. So that we've had a long 18th century from 1688 to 1815, a long 19th century from 1789 to 1815. Just for variety's sake, we've had a short 20th century from 1918 to 1989, thanks to Eric Hobsbawm. There's always, of course, the possibility that Donald Trump will yet give us an even shorter 21st century, but that's another matter. And these aren't just eye-catching games. There's a serious point. The points at which we choose to begin and end our narrative, in many cases, structures what we actually say about the period between those 2 points. For example, I've often wondered how far our addiction to starting and finishing books with periods of bloodshed and warfare, 1641, 1603, 1641, 1688 and so on. How far has that actually tilted the whole enterprise towards overemphasising the role of conflict and warfare in Irish history? So, how have the editors of the Cambridge History approached this task? Well, they have made brave and challenging choices throughout. First point to note is that the very first volume begins in 600. That's right, folks, there's no 6th century. So it is nice to see that Queen's University's most prominent recent contribution to historical analysis is so authoritatively honoured in the layout of these volumes. The other dates they select, 1550, 1730, 1880, are chosen to indicate loosely defined eras, rather than very specific turning points. And this has the great advantage of avoiding rigid divisions. Excuse me. This means, for example, that Christopher McGinn, who writes a chapter on the period 1470 to 1550, can define it as an 80-year period of accumulated change, avoiding the whole sterile debate about when does medieval give way to modern. The most dramatic of all is, of course, Volume 3, which covers the period 1730 to 1880, which its editor bravely titles in his introduction, Late Early Modern. Now, that's a point at which we all, I think, step back for a minute and think. At first sight, it might seem odd, for example, to have the Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal and the First Decades of Holland and Wolfe within the same volume on the same era. On the other hand, when I think about it, I can see a perfectly good case for saying that Charles Stewart Parnell is the end of a tradition that began roughly around the time of the founding of the Dublin Society around 1730. And that's the real point of the exercise. It's not to say that one periodization is better than another. It's to ask us to think again about some of the assumptions we make about what are the turning points in Irish history and what are the big developments we should be focusing on. And there, the whole 4 volumes succeed, I think, triumphantly. The other big problem of periodization, the last point I'll make, is, of course, for any comprehensive historical survey, what do you do about the recent past? Where does it make sense for the author to lay down his or her pen and to say that anything else that happens is for our colleagues in journalism rather than history? And here there is no shortage of examples urging extreme caution. Some of us will remember Joseph Lee's blockbuster history of 20th century Ireland, for example, which ended with a long chapter explaining in great detail how this was a society doomed to continued economic mediocrity because of inbuilt flaws in its culture and social structure. That was, of course, in 1989. 5 years before, independent Ireland at least entered on an unprecedented period of economic growth, which transformed out of all recognition the society he was talking about. A year later, in 1990, the great Eric Hobsbawm brought out the published version of the Wiles lectures he had given here in Queen's 2 years before. And the central argument being that nationalism was a declining force in Western society. And he had to admit in the book, in a footnote, that the 2 years as he'd given the lectures had seen things become a bit unpleasant in the former Yugoslavia. But, he said, there had been no serious loss of life as a result. So it was only a blip in the historical arc. So, taking your narrative right up to yesterday carries real risks. And given that's the case, I think the historians, the authors of the relevant chapters in these volumes deserve credit for being willing to carry their discussion right up to almost to the date of publication. John O'Hagan, writing on the economy, very carefully balances an assessment of the crash of 2008, which is the moment, of course, Joe Lee could have said, I was right after all, and the subsequent apparent recovery, and he balances that by admission that we need more time before we give a final verdict. John and Paul View, writing on Northern Ireland, have no choice but to leave their story suspended in midair with the collapse of the devolved government. But they do actually finish that chapter on a much more profound point, that regardless of what happens next, the days have gone when a political impasse in Northern Ireland would engage the full resources of international diplomacy from the White House down. Instead, they say, the inhabitants of Northern Ireland have returned to a quieter world of provincial self-regard or competing provincial self-regards. Now, that judgment is not going to sell many copies in parts of Belfast, but it is wonderful to hear historians say what to most others is the unsayable. So, to sum up, this is a more than worthy successor to New History Ireland, first launched half a century ago. I can sum it up best, I think, in the words of Gore Vidal, possibly overrated novelist, possibly underrated historian, who said, every time a friend succeeds, something inside me dies. So I hope that Tom Bartlett, Jane Olmire, Jimmy Kelly, and all the other friends of mine involved in this volume will take it in the right spirit when I say that reading these volumes, I died 1,000 times. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean. We're very proud here at Queen's that 8 of the 103 contributors to the Cambridge History of Ireland are current or recent scholars here at the university. And I'm delighted that one of the Queen's contributors, Professor Mary O'Dowd, who's our Professor of Gender History here at Queen's, and the author of the chapter in Volume 2 on men, women and the family in Ireland from 1550 to 1730, is able to come and say a few words on behalf of the contributors. So, Mary, if you'd like to come to the front.
Okay, so I should say I am speaking as a contributor, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the contributors, the Queen's contributors, because I haven't actually spoken to any of them about what I'm going to say. Okay, so I'm just going to make a few comments on what I've read so far. Unlike Sean, I haven't read through all 4 volumes as yet. So I would like, obviously, to congratulate the editors on the production of this 4-volume history. And as Sean has done, many people have lauded them for getting us across the line within their original time schedule. I think part of the reason we all followed up so quickly was that we did get, at the very beginning, a very detailed schedule from Jane and Tom as to the dates at which we had to have different things produced. But I also think Sean mentioned the New History of Ireland, which took such a long time to come out, and one of the contributors to Volume 1 in the New History was telling me earlier that 2 people, I think, died before their contribution in Volume 1 came out, which was one of the last volumes to appear, even though the initial draft, I think, was written in the 1970s. Okay, so one of the reasons I think that we all did get on board, and I think Sean sort of hinted at this, is that the academic world really has changed in the last 25 years, and that we are now all a little bit more biddable than an earlier generation, and probably, as he hinted, more anxious to meet deadlines and to conform to the research assessment exercises that we have been given to go through, whether it's in the UK or increasingly in the Republic or elsewhere. So probably we are more inclined as a, no, I won't say as the current generation, but I'll come back to that in a moment. We are more inclined now, I think, than a previous generation to perhaps do what we're told, more than an older generation of scholars were inclined to do, and that may or may not be a good thing. Sean mentioned that a lot of the comparisons with the New History within the volumes are very favourable, but there's equally been some criticism about the New History being focused on political history, that it was a little bit boring to read. But I think, as Sean has outlined, they were just asking different questions than the Cambridge history. And I do think the Cambridge history in particular, I would agree with everything that Sean has said, but I would also think the Cambridge history is really a landmark in Irish social history, because that has been a surprisingly underdeveloped field of research in Irish historiographical terms. And I think for the first time in a general history of this kind, we are now able to trace different themes in Irish social history from the early medieval period right up to the 20th century or the 21st century. So themes, as Sean mentioned, such as the history of the family, are well represented in the volumes and would indeed now enable somebody, for example, to teach an undergraduate course on the history of the family over that long period. And of course, I also welcome the chapters that focus on women, and also the chapters where some of the authors, at least, are beginning to integrate gender into their analysis, which again is another question that an earlier generation of historians were not doing. Cambridge history has also been presented as a younger generation's interpretation of Irish history. But this emphasis on the younger generation doesn't quite work for all the contributors. and it certainly doesn't work for me. So I hope we don't get too precious about viewing these 4 volumes as an official interpretation of a generation, or indeed as a sort of static interpretation. Because I think one of the attractions of many of the contributions that I have read is that they often are asking questions for which there are no straightforward answers. Either the research hasn't been done, or that the questions are quite complicated and it isn't possible to give one straightforward answer. For example, in Volume 3, there's a chapter on demography, and the author, Dr. Brian Guerin, acknowledges that we still have no clear answer as to why the Irish population increased so dramatically in the 18th and early 19th centuries, that is, in the decades before the Great Famine. We can trace the way in which it increases, but there's no one answer as to why that increase was so dramatic over that period of time. And this is probably a question that will continue, no doubt, to be asked by another generation of historians. In my own contribution, I suggest that the destruction of many records and many historical records in the Public Record Office in 1922 was a great tragedy. But we have, I think, focused too much on what was destroyed and not enough on what has survived. Because we do have a large number of documents for the early modern period, for example, on wills, court records and various kinds, which do enable us to say some interesting things about the social history of early modern Ireland. And I would hope, too, that the documents that I used in my chapter would also then be looked at again by other historians and other researchers, and that they would begin to question or interrogate some of my conclusions. And I would hope, too, that other chapters would also be interrogated in the same way. So, in other words, that no interpretation is the final one, even for a generation. I would also like to thank Cambridge University Press. As Sean mentioned, they've been very strong supporters of and good friends of Irish history. This is the second big project in Irish history that they have sponsored in recent decades, the other being the Dictionary of Irish Biography. But as my final point, I would like to draw attention to the fact that many of the contributors draw on the work produced by Irish publishers. So over the past 25 years, Irish publishing houses such as Four Courts Press, Irish Academic Press, Cork University Press have all produced collections of essays on very innovative topics such as the history of atrocity, history of death, history of children, and material culture. And the contributors to these volumes draw on all of these volumes produced by Irish publishers. And I think this is worth emphasising, because many of these collections of essays published by Irish publishers would not be rated very highly in a university assessment exercise, or indeed in a CV for an academic post. Yet over the past 25 years, these collections of essays have played an essential role in the writing and analysis of Irish history. And I think we would be poorer intellectually without them. So I would say thank you to CUP, but I would also say thank you to the Irish publishers who have made these volumes possible.
Thank you very much, Mary. We have 3 of the 4 members of the editorial team behind the Cambridge History of Ireland with us today. Professor Jim Allmeyer from Trinity College Dublin, Professor Jimmy Kelly from Dublin City University, and Professor Tom Bartlett, late of the University of Aberdeen. Running us in Professor Brendan Smith from the University of Bristol. Tom is the general editor. I suppose that's primus inter pares in the editorial board, and he's very kindly agreed to come and say a few words about how the project has been put together and how it's been brought to such a successful outcome. So, Tom.
Good evening, everyone. My thanks to Professor Sean Connolly for his kind remarks, thoughtful comments on the Cambridge history of Ireland, and to Professor Mary O'Dowd as well for her insightful analysis of the contributions as they appeared. I also have to thank Professor Peter Gray and the School of History at QUB for hosting this event, and a special thank you to John Cunningham for his valuable assistance at the beginning of this project and for helping to organise this gathering to mark the publication of the Cambridge History of Ireland. It's a special pleasure for me to be here, speaking as a former student of history at Queen's, and I think whoever mentioned that there were 8 contributors perhaps ought to enlarge that to 9 from Queen's University, because I was an undergraduate here as well as doing my doctoral research here back in the 60s and 70s. Now, it's no secret that not a few eyebrows, put it mildly, were raised when I announced that I had agreed to act as General Editor for the proposed Cambridge History of Ireland some 5 or 6 years ago. Historians would let you down, it was claimed. They had a poor record of working collectively. A reasonable schedule for publication, a reasonable time frame would be impossible to realise. Look at the New History of Ireland, published by Oxford, first volume out in 1976, last volume 30 years later in 2006. This is what I would be looking at, I was told, if I undertook this project. Now, the fears that the project itself and a reasonable schedule for publication might well have been realised. They might well have been realised, but for the energy, drive and commitment of my fellow editors, James, Jimmy, Jane and Brendan, who were determined that the work would be finished in an agreed time frame, that all 4 volumes, very importantly, would be published together, and they would encourage their authors to keep to schedule and to write in a stylish and lucid prose where possible. So my thanks to them, my editors, and to the contributors, over 100 of them, who responded with alacrity to the call. Now, I agreed to be General Editor in this series because I'd become concerned that the explosion in publications in Irish history over the past 40 years had rendered the subject all but inaccessible to both the student and the interested reader. For that reason, a new synthesis, drawing on the most recent scholarship, was badly needed, and that it was badly one that would pull together the most significant writings on Irish history and provide a stimulus to further research. Go back down memory lane. When I began the serious study of Irish history here at Queen's in the 1960s, there were very few scholarly monographs available, perhaps no more than a dozen, and they were appearing 1 or 2 per annum. Scholarly monographs, I mean books that met the key requirements for evidence-based research and scholarly rigour. But the 1 and 2 books that came out in the 1960s had expanded to around 30 per annum by around 2000, and probably reached, I think, well over 100 by this year, 2018. Already previous speakers have mentioned, but Four Courts Press alone expects to publish 50 books, 50, on Irish history this year. And Irish Academic Press, Lilliput, Cork University Press, UCD Press, the Royal Irish Academy, the Ulster Historical Foundation will also publish a number of books on Irish history this year. Journals devoted to Irish history have appeared in large numbers over the last 40 years. It used to be just Irish Historical Studies, or Analecta Hibernia, perhaps, or Archivium Hibernicum. But now we have Irish Economic and Social History, Saher, 18th Century Ireland, History Ireland, and others. And outside Ireland, university presses at Oxford, Cambridge, but also Manchester and Liverpool, more recently, in the UK, and in the US at Princeton, Notre Dame, and at Madison, Wisconsin, all publish, I think, a steady stream of works on Irish history. Now, quite why books and articles on Irish history continue to be published in such large numbers And here I draw on my experience in working in Aberdeen, whereas there is a very sharp contrast with the situation in Scotland, where historians of that country struggle to find a publisher. This question must remain a discussion for another day. The short answer that Irish history books sell and Scottish history books don't is true enough, but raises other important questions in turn. Whatever, the fact remains that publications and PhD theses on Irish history have proliferated over the last 40 years. Many articles of Irish interest are frequently published in the leading international journals as well. And as a result, we are seriously in danger of not being able to see the wood for the trees, and this makes the need for a new synthesis all the more pressing. And this is what the Cambridge History of Ireland aims to provide. Now, there's a further reason why a new 4-volume work on Irish history is justified, and here I come back to the last multi-volume, which has already been mentioned a number of times, The New History of Ireland, Oxford, 9 volumes, 1976 to 2006. The brainchild of Theo Moody of Trinity, this was an amazing enterprise for its time, imaginative, creative, with many wonderful chapters that set new standards of scholarship. It remains a very valuable addition to the writing of Irish history. However, it was also a work of its time, as shown by its almost entirely male cast of contributors. 4 of the projected early team of some 50 scholars were women. Its emphasis on politics distinguished, usually high politics. Its rather dull writing, this was not just by accident, this was designedly dull writing. Rhetorical flourishes were firmly discouraged. No exclamation marks, please. And perhaps there was a general lack of interest in social or economic matters. But I think more importantly, the entire project was conceived in the 1960s, when most academic historians believed that the furies that had beset the history of Ireland were comfortably in the past, and that a bright, trouble-free and troubles-free history beckoned. Irish history could now finally be told because it had been removed from Irish politics. Here's Theo Moody in 1968 announcing his plans for the new history. It could not hardly be said that Ireland is in the van of ecumenism, but in a surprisingly short time a great deal of theological ice has been thawed. Clergy have been willing to talk to each other in public as well as in private, in a way that seemed impossible a year or so ago. All of which, he noted, creates an atmosphere favourable to the pursuit of history. Now, it's very easy to scoff, and historians, as we know, make terrible profits. But scarcely anyone at the time foresaw what was coming down the track in 1968. Other historians were equally sanguine about the future for Ireland. The popular historian, the first Telly Dawn, A.J.P. Taylor, declared that the Irish question was over. David Lloyd George, none other, had solved it. The result, I think, was that when the Northern Troubles broke, the entire concept that underlay the new history, at least in Moody's vision of it, was revealed as flawed. Now, this did not, of course, derail the entire project, but there was a cautious tone to the writing throughout, an understandable desire not to add fuel to the mayhem in the north, and thus a shying away, I think, from the uglier aspects of Irish history, massacres, evictions, sectarianism, colonisation, for example, that I think rendered the entire finished product rather uneven and I think ultimately unsatisfactory. Now, the historians writing in the Cambridge History of Ireland, by contrast, have for the most part come of age in the era of the Troubles, and are thus all too mindful of the furies that lie below and sometimes above the surface of Irish life, and their chapters, to an extent, will reflect this. Now, this doesn't mean that there will be a focus on atrocity, or that the rosy optimism that underpinned the new history will be replaced in the Cambridge History of Ireland by a gloomy pessimism. But rather that, where appropriate, the role of violence in the making of Ireland would be considered, and that the definition of atrocity might be extended to cover such questions as the treatment of orphans, unmarried mothers, poor and the destitute. And therein, I think, lies the final justification for bringing this book to publication, these volumes to publication. In the years since the publication of the new history, new questions have been addressed by a remarkably talented cohort of historians on gender, sex, print, environment, culture, sport, leisure, memory, among other topics. These were topics that were scarcely touched upon in the earlier volumes. In addition, these new questions, along with old questions on the Vikings, politics, land, insurgency, the economy, social life and religion, indeed the entire early modern period from 1500 to 1850, have benefited in their treatment from a massive amount of new material that has come on stream in the last 40 years. We've already had mention of the great deal of radical transformation of our understanding of medieval history as a result of the archaeological activity that accompanied the economic boom of the Celtic Taggart era. All those roads being built, archaeologists were employed, and the results of this can be seen in some of the chapters in Volume 1 and 2. A short list of these sources might include the vastly improved calendars of state papers, witness statements from the Irish Revolution, pension records from the Irish Revolution as well, witness statements from the 1641 Rising, Corpus na Gaeilge, Irish language sources, early English books online, the digitised records of the medieval Irish Chancery, and many, many more. The chapters in the in the Cambridge History of Ireland reveal the influence of these new online materials, and here every historian has to raise a glass to the archivists who were instrumental in making this material available. As with the Irish historians of old, this history is dedicated An Glóra Dé agus An Nóra na hÉireann, to the glory of God and honour of Ireland. Thank you very much.